Meta guns, good guns, and other guns. Call of Duty Warzone has dozens of weapons to choose from, but with that many options, it can be hard to know which are good and which are trash. That's where the tier list comes in. Now, I've already made one of these videos talking about 10 of the assault rifles in Warzone, so if you haven't seen that, you can watch that here. But today, I'm going to be going over the other 11 assault rifles that I didn't get a chance to talk about last time. And like I said in my last video, this is going to be an ongoing series with tier lists covering every single weapon class in Warzone, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that. But anyways, let's get into the definitive Warzone Season 4 Reloaded Assault Rifles tier list, Part 2. First up on the list is one of the most iconic guns of all time, the AK-47. But specifically the Modern Warfare variant. It is important to note that this is the Modern Warfare version because the Modern Warfare AK and the Cold War AK are vastly different. And right off the bat, it's kind of underwhelming. It has decent damage, but the damage range isn't great and it's way too shaky to be reliable at any sort of range. Plus, if you try to use this thing up close, you're still gonna get outgunned by somebody running an SMG. All in all, I don't think this one is worth using, so I'm gonna give it an E tier. Next up, we have one of the more obscure guns from Modern Warfare, the AN-94. Now, the AN-94 was another gun that was never really in the meta, so it didn't reach the same levels of popularity like the AMAX or the RAM-7 did. This was one gun that didn't get touched by the nerf at all, which is probably because, much like the player base, Activision has completely forgotten that it ever existed. This gun's claim to fame is something called the Hyperburst feature, which fires the first 2 bullets out of the magazine at a super fast rate, which essentially prevents additional recoil from that second shot. But after the first 2 Hyperburst shots, it's pretty average. It reminded me a bit of the AMAX, but it feels like it does less damage overall, and I think the overall recoil is higher. While you could be effective with this gun if you take the time to master it, I wouldn't waste your time doing so. There's so many other guns that are more viable and way easier to use right off the bat, so I'm going to give this one a D tier. Next up is the FN Scar 17. I was curious what this one was going to feel like, having never played with it before and having heard quite a few people say that it's been their favorite gun since the release of the game. And honestly, I think the Scar is still pretty viable. It checks all the boxes for a standard AR, good damage, good range, and not a ton of recoil. At the same time though, the Scar falls victim to the same thing that most of the other guns on this list do. It's not the meta. While I think the Scar is still a perfectly balanced AR, it's not going to catch up to a gun like the Krig. For that, I'm going to put the Scar right in the middle of the pack at a C tier. Next up is the Nerf gun, Grau 5.56. Now, a lot of people still swear by this gun due to its low recoil, but personally, I don't really see the appeal. It was great once, but at this point, with guns like the RAM-7 having almost as little recoil, or guns like the Krig having significantly less, I don't really think the Grau is viable. On top of that, it does so little damage that you have to hit shot after shot after shot and still wonder, why is this guy not dying? I'm sure I'm going to have people disagreeing with me on this one just because the Grau was such a fan favorite for so long, but I'm going to have to put it in D tier. Next after the Grau is basically a second Grau, the M13. Both of these guns play and feel basically exactly the same, with the M13 doing a bit more damage at range and the Grau shredding a bit more up close. Technically the M13 got buffed with air quotes, but all they did was increase the minimum damage from 19 to 20. To put that into perspective, when we compare that to the Krig, which also got a minimum damage increase, but from 25 to 26, it becomes really easy to see how far behind the M13 is. You can make the claim that it still has low recoil, but again, it still has more recoil than the Krig, which does more damage anyway. I think this is just another case of a gun that is completely outpaced by everything else on this list, so it's gonna go in E tier. Next up, we have what is quite possibly the most useless assault rifle in Warzone, the FR 5.56. I don't have much to say about this one except why. Why does this exist? At this point, with the Cold War tac rifles being as strong as they are even after their big Season 2 nerf, a 3-round burst weapon as an AR just feels pointless. This gun did shine for a bit back in the early days of Warzone when it had a completely broken underbarrel shotgun attachment. But if anything, that shows you how bad this gun really is if the best thing about it was an attachment that turned it into a completely different type of gun. It has decent damage, but absolutely no range, leaving you to use it up close, but it can't compete with the fire rate of SMGs. So you're left with a gun that can't be used effectively at mid-range, long-range, or short-range, so what am I supposed to do with it? Use it to slap the enemy in the head? All in all, I think the FR 5.56 is the poster child for guns that Activision has completely forgotten about and has given up on any attempts to make it somewhat usable in the game. Obviously, you know where this thing's going, F tier. After that scathing review, we go to our first Cold War gun on the list today, the C58. Now, I had never used this gun much besides those terrible ground loot C58s that are absolutely everywhere. So I was pretty surprised when it played halfway decent. It did get nerfed quite a bit, taking decreases to the headshot, upper torso, and lower torso multipliers, as well as some increased recoil. But honestly, I don't know that that really made a difference. It also got a slight buff to its damage range, which definitely shows because this thing absolutely beams at range. It has a bit of recoil, but if you set it up right, it's not too hard to control. All in all, I think the C58 is a pretty decent choice for a mid to long range AR, so I'm gonna give it a B tier. Next up is the Odin. This gun was kind of hard to place in the tier list for two reasons. First, its damage is absolutely insane for a full auto weapon. Yes, it has a slow rate of fire, but that doesn't really matter when you're able to kill in just a few shots to the head or chest. But at the same time, this gun has some of the worst recoil of anything I've seen in the game. However, I do think that is manageable either by tapping the trigger to fire slower and thereby release recoil, or by mounting the gun to completely eliminate it. And if you can overcome the high recoil, you end up with a beast of a gun that can absolutely destroy at long ranges. But given that the success of this gun is directly tied to how well you can manage the recoil, I'm only going to give it a B tier. Next up is the other version of the AK-47, the Cold War AK. This thing is absolutely phenomenal. Yes, it has a slow rate of fire and a high amount of recoil, but I personally think it makes up for that with the sheer amount of damage that it does. Its headshot multiplier and upper torso multiplier did get nerfed a little bit, but I'm not sure that that really matters in the grand scheme of things. You really have two choices when you're setting up this AK, either for long range or for short range. Personally, I recommend the short range because it absolutely destroys, but I do think it's viable either way. This AK is going to get the first and only A tier of the guns I'm reviewing today. Next up, we have another Cold War gun, the Groza. To me, the Groza plays a lot like a close range version of the QBZ. It has a pretty decent fire rate and pretty good damage, but quite a bit of recoil. And much like the QBZ, I think this gun is viable if you want to use it, but I'm not really sure why you would. I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but there's just better options out there to choose from. It can be set up for use at mid-range, but given the recoil pattern, I don't know that I would recommend that. I think this gun works the best as a close-range AR and can honestly compete with some of the off-meta SMGs. But beyond that, there's not really anything special about it, so it's gonna go in C tier. Next, we have the very last assault rifle in Warzone, the Kilo. And when it comes to the Kilo, I have one question. Was this gun ever good? I know that a long time ago it used to be the meta, but using it today, it feels pretty worthless. It's too shaky and has too much of a damage drop-off to be used at long range, and doesn't have the handling speeds to compete at close range. Again, I think this is another case of a gun that is just terribly outpaced by all of its competitors and isn't viable in the current state of the game. So it's gonna go in E tier. Well, that's gonna do it for today's video. I hope that you enjoyed it and found this information helpful. The next tier list video should be coming out soon, so stay tuned for that. But anyways guys, please consider subscribing. It only takes a second and it really helps me out. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.